Night. June 16, 1944. Somewhere in the jungle darkness of Saipan, a Japanese Type 97 medium tank grinds through a narrow ravine, its diesel engine growling like something alive and hungry. The turret rotates slowly, the 57mm cannon searching for a target it cannot yet see. The tank is heading straight for the 6th Marines Regimental Command Post, where Colonel James P. Risley is coordinating the American response to the largest Japanese tank attack in the history of the Pacific War. Risley does not know the tank is coming. Watching from a ridge above the ravine, a 29-year-old first lieutenant from a small steel town in western Pennsylvania sees the tank moving through the dark. He has 40 men behind him. Every single one was recruited from the brig or the punishment details. The Marine Corps calls them criminals, troublemakers, the refuse of the regiment. He calls them the finest fighters he has ever commanded. His name is Frank Tuchovsky. He is holding a stolen bazooka, and he is about to run toward the tank. But this story does not begin here. It begins 67 years later in a church in Wisconsin, where a son discovers that his quiet, modest father was a war hero who never said a single word about what he did. September 2011. Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, a small lakeside town nestled on the Door County Peninsula where Lake Michigan meets Green Bay. Maple trees lining the streets have just begun to turn gold and crimson. American flags hang from every porch, as they have for as long as anyone can remember. The church on the hill smells of candle wax and old wood, and sunlight falls through stained glass onto the pews where mourners have gathered to say goodbye to Frank Tuchovsky. He was 96 years old. Beloved mayor, community pillar, the kind of man who organized the 4th of July parade every year, who coached Little League until his knees gave out, who sat on the city council before serving as mayor, and never once raised his voice in a meeting. He knew every shopkeeper on 3rd Avenue by name. He fixed his neighbor's plumbing without being asked. He drove to Madison for Badgers football games with the same group of friends for 30 years. Everyone in Sturgeon Bay knew Frank Tuchovsky. No one knew what he had done before he came to this town. Joseph Tuchovsky, Frank's son, sits in the front pew. He is a restaurant consultant from Minneapolis, a practical man who inherited his father's quiet competence. He knows his father was a Marine. He knows Frank served somewhere in the Pacific during the war. Beyond that, almost nothing. Frank kept a footlocker in the garage that was, in Joseph's words, off limits. Not locked, just understood. You did not open it the same way you did not ask questions. The war was a closed door in a house with many open ones, and Joseph had accepted his father's silence the way children accept weather. It was simply part of who Frank was. Then a man Joseph barely recognizes stands up to deliver a eulogy. William Parsons, a Sturgeon Bay native who met Frank in 1955 at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Frank was an older student on the GEI Bill, 40 years old, sitting in lecture halls with teenagers. Parsons was one of those teenagers enrolled in Naval ROTC. Despite the age gap, the two became friends because both were from the same small town. Parsons tells the church a story he heard years later from one of Frank's Marines, a sergeant named Al Yunker. The story is about an island called Saipan, about a night when Japanese tanks broke through American lines, and one tank headed straight for the command post where senior officers were coordinating the entire battle. About a first lieutenant named Tuchovsky, who grabbed a bazooka and ran alone to intercept that tank, who destroyed it with a single shot, whose one act of courage redirected an entire Japanese infantry assault away from the most vulnerable point in Marine defenses and saved his platoon, his commanding officer, and possibly the entire American position. The church goes dead silent. Joseph feels the floor shift beneath him. He has never heard this story. Not once. Not a whisper. Not a hint. His mother, Roxy, who passed years earlier, never mentioned it. His father carried this inside him for 66 years, through a marriage, through raising a family, through decades of public service, without saying a single word. If a pin had dropped on that carpet, Joseph later said, you would have heard it. What else did Frank Tuchovsky carry in silence? What was in that footlocker, and who were the men who fought beside him on an island most Americans have forgotten? Days after the funeral, Joseph drives to the garage. The footlocker sits where it has always sat. Olive drab metal, the kind issued to every Marine in the Second World War. It smells of canvas and old leather when he lifts the lid. Inside, he finds a platoon roster for the 6th Marine Regiment Scout and Sniper Platoon. 42 names in faded ink on yellowed paper. Letters between Frank and Roxy spanning 3 years tied in bundles with frayed ribbon. The handwriting careful and small, to fit as much as possible on government-issue stationery. A silver star citation. A bronze star citation. Photographs of young men in jungle fatigues, some of them boys who looked barely old enough to shave. And a December 1944 issue of Leatherneck magazine, with an article titled, Tchaikovsky's Terrors. Joseph sits on the concrete floor and reads. It was, he would later say, like time travel and Christmas at the same time. The article, written by Marine Corps correspondent Vic Kallman, described his father as the commander of some of the craziest, fiercest, most lovable Marines on Saipan. The platoon had wreaked havoc in, around, and mostly behind the enemy lines. Their unofficial escapades were becoming Marine Corps legends. Joseph turns to the roster. 42 names. He searches each one online. Most lead to obituaries. These men lived quiet lives after the war and died without telling their stories. But 3 are still alive. Bob Smots in Georgia. Roscoe Mullins in West Virginia. Marvin Strombo in Missoula, Montana. Joseph begins making phone calls. When the old men hear the name Tchaikovsky, when they learn it is Ski's son, something changes in their voices. The walls that held for decades begin to crack. This is where the story truly begins. Not in a garage in Wisconsin, on a blood-soaked island in the Pacific 67 years earlier, November 1943. The Battle of Tarawa, a coral sandbar the size of the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The 2nd Marine Division sent 18,000 men against 4,500 entrenched Japanese. The tide came in too low. Higgins' boats grounded on the reef 500 yards from shore. Marines climbed out and waded through chest-deep water holding rifles above their heads, while Japanese machine guns raked them from pillboxes they could not see. The first wave suffered 75% casualties. In 76 hours of the most savage fighting of the Pacific War, approximately 1,000 Americans died and over 2,000 were wounded. The photographs that reached home showed bodies floating in the surf and stacked on the beach. The nation was horrified. Among the survivors was First Lieutenant Frank Tchaikovsky, 28 years old, from New Brighton, Pennsylvania, a coal country boy who grew up during the Depression watching neighbors lose their homes. He joined the Marines because it was the only door open. By Tarawa, he had already fought on Guadalcanal and survived malaria, dysentery, and bonsai charges that came screaming out of the jungle darkness. Tarawa did not break his courage. It broke his faith in how the Marine Corps fought. The problem was intelligence. Marines had landed blind. They did not know where the pillboxes were until they were being killed by them. They did not know about the reef until boats were grinding to a halt on it. Men died because no one had gone ashore first to find out what was waiting. Colonel James P. Risley, commanding officer of the 6th Marine Regiment, reached the same conclusion. Risley was a career Marine Naval Academy class of 1922, born in Shandaken, New York, a veteran of Haiti and Nicaragua. His men called him Gentleman Jim because he led without shouting, earned loyalty through competence, and never humiliated a subordinate in front of his troops. At Tarawa, Risley watched too many young men die walking into positions that could have been identified and destroyed if someone had gone in first. Risley wanted a specialized unit, not just snipers, scouts who could penetrate Japanese territory alone, map fortifications, call in artillery coordinates, survive for days behind enemy lines, and kill silently when necessary. The Marine Corps had nothing like it. Risley would build one from scratch. He chose Tchaikovsky to do it. Tchaikovsky had a theory about Marines. The Corps trained men to follow orders, hold formation, and fight as a unit. Those qualities won conventional battles. But the missions Tchaikovsky envisioned required the opposite: men who thought for themselves, who broke rules, who could improvise when everything went wrong. He found them in the brig. If a man had been written up for brawling, Tchaikovsky explained that meant he could handle himself. The man who wins the fight goes to the brig. The man who loses goes to the infirmary. I want the man in the brig. Over weeks at Camp Tarawa on the Big Island of Hawaii, where the 2nd Marine Division was training for the next operation, Tchaikovsky assembled his platoon. He pulled men from punishment details across the division. He visited the brig, personally interviewing inmates the way a baseball scout evaluates minor league talent. He wanted fighters, thieves, and survivors. He found all 3. Marvin Strombo, 19 years old. From Dixon, Montana, a farming hamlet on the Flathead Indian Reservation, so small it barely appeared on maps. The youngest of 4 brothers, all of whom were serving simultaneously. His brother Oliver was in the 2nd Marines fighting the same battles on different beaches. Their mother and Dixon had 4 sons at war and went to church every morning to pray them home. Marvin grew up hunting elk and mule deer in the Bitterroot Mountains with a bolt-action rifle, learning the patience that comes from hours of stillness, watching a ridgeline for movement. That patience was exactly what a scout sniper needed. Roscoe Mullins, from Cayford Mountain, West Virginia, deep in coal country. His father worked the mines. His grandfather worked the mines. Every man Mullins knew growing up went underground before dawn and came back after dark, coughing coal dust. Mullins was built like the mountains he came from, short, thick through the shoulders, hands like shovels. He joined the Marines to escape the mines and found himself underground again on Saipan, crawling through Japanese tunnel systems in total darkness. He and Strombo became inseparable from boot camp onward, the kind of bond forged in shared terror that no peacetime friendship can replicate. Bill Knupple, platoon sergeant, from Minnesota, the oldest and steadiest man in the platoon. Knupple had served with Tuchovsky since 1941, when the 6th Marines deployed to Iceland as the first American forces sent overseas in the war, months before Pearl Harbor. He survived Guadalcanal and Tarawa. He knew Leon Uris, the future novelist serving in the same company, who would later write about a notorious group of thieves within the 6th Regiment. When Joseph Tuchovsky asked Knupple decades later if those fictional characters were based on the 40 Thieves, the old sergeant smiled and said one word. Somewhat. Bob Smots, from Atlanta, Georgia. Southern in the way that meant patient and polite and capable of extraordinary violence when patience ran out. Smots carried something the others shared but rarely spoke about. The reason I had trouble talking about what happened, he told Joseph years after the war, was that I feared I was beyond forgiveness for the things I had done. Russell Dyer. Martin Russell Dyer, Jr. Not a brig recruit, but a proven combat veteran of Guadalcanal. The man everyone wanted beside them in a foxhole. He had a face that turned white as paper before combat, but when the shooting started, he moved forward when everyone else wanted to flatten against the earth. He would earn the Navy Cross on Saipan for deliberately exposing himself to enemy fire, so his squad mates could locate a machine gun position. He was killed on June 30th, 1944. He was 21 years old. Mullins would cry about Dyer's death for the rest of his life, even when he could speak of every other loss with dry eyes. Training at Camp Tarawa focused on skills the standard Marine Corps did not teach. Silent killing with knives, with bare hands, with piano wire, fitted with wooden handles. How to approach a sentry from behind and eliminate him without making a sound. How to move through jungle without disturbing vegetation. How to read Japanese maps and call in naval gunfire with precision. The platoon practiced with M1903, Springfield rifles fitted with inertal, 8 power scopes, learning to hit targets at 600 yards. They trained with bazookas. They studied Japanese tactics and fortification patterns, and they stole everything that was not bolted down. The Marine Corps in 1944 was the poorest equipped branch of the American military. Marines received surplus weapons from the First War, outdated equipment, and inadequate rations. To survive, they stole from better supplied Army and Navy units. Tuchovsky's men elevated theft to artistry. They raided Army supply depots at night for food. They hit Navy warehouses for equipment. They stole a Jeep from an Army captain, and in the words of one thief, beat the hell out of that thing. Other Marines in the 6th Regiment watched these raids with a mixture of envy and admiration and gave them the name that stuck forever: the 40 Thieves. By June 1944, the platoon was ready. 40 men who could fight hide and kill without making noise. 40 men who had memorized Japanese fortification patterns and studied aerial photographs of an island they had never seen. 40 men who understood that their mission was to go where no other Americans would go and come back with information that would save lives or not come back at all. Then came the briefing. A Quonset hut at Camp Tarawa. Maps of Saipan pinned to plywood boards. The island sat 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, 14 miles long and 5 miles wide. Mount Tapocho rose 1,554 feet in the center, giving the Japanese observation over every beach and every valley. There was no place to land where the enemy could not see you. Saipan was not just another island, It was considered Japanese home territory. Civilians had lived there for decades. The garrison numbered approximately 30,000 troops under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, supplemented by naval forces under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same man who had commanded the strike force at Pearl Harbor. The island bristled with concrete pillboxes, interconnected trenches, underground bunkers, and artillery positions registered to cover every approach. If the Americans took Saipan, B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo. The Japanese knew this. They would fight to the last man. Intelligence officers delivered the casualty projections for scout sniper units in the Pacific Theater. 73%. The room went quiet. 3 out of 4 men sitting in those folding chairs would be killed or wounded in the next month. The mathematics had not changed. The war always needed more bodies. Tchaikovsky looked at the faces of his platoon. Strombo, 19, from a Montana ranch. Knuppel, who had been with him since Iceland and should by all reasonable odds already be dead. Dyer, who turned white before combat but fought like something possessed. Mullins, who left the coal mines of West Virginia for this. These were the men the Marine Corps called criminals. These were the men who chose combat over military prison. Now they were about to find out exactly what that choice would cost. Their mission on Saipan was simple in description and nearly impossible in execution. Land with the first assault wave on June 15th. Push inland immediately ahead of the main force. Locate Japanese positions and radio coordinates back to artillery and naval gunfire units. Then disappear into the jungle and continue mapping enemy fortifications for days at a time behind enemy lines. No reinforcement, no resupply, no rescue if captured. The night before the landing, June 14th, 1944. The invasion fleet had arrived off Saipan, the largest yet, assembled for a single operation in the Pacific. Old battleships resurrected from Pearl Harbor pounded the island with their heavy guns. The shore glowed orange. Explosions flashed behind the ridgelines like distant lightning. Below decks in the transport ships, Marines checked weapons for the 10th time, wrote letters they hoped no one would ever need to read, prayed to gods they half believed in, and tried to sleep in the stifling holds that stank of diesel and sweat and fear. Some men played cards all night. Some cleaned their rifles obsessively. Some sat alone and stared at the steel bulkhead. Everyone was afraid. The difference between a coward and a brave man, the Marines had learned, was not the absence of fear. It was what you did when the ramp went down. Tchaikovsky walked through the berthing area one last time, stopping at each man. A word, a nod, a handshake. He knew the numbers. He knew that some of these faces would not exist tomorrow. The toughest thing ski-faced Strombo would tell Joseph decades later was sending people out on missions knowing that they were going to get shot up. That was something he had to live with. He had to make that decision of which ones go out and either live or die. Want to know if these men survive what is waiting for them on Saipan? Hit that like button. It helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The 40 thieves deserve to be remembered. The men who fought beside them deserve to be known. Dawn, June 15, 1944. The naval bombardment reaches a crescendo that shakes the ocean itself. Saipan disappears behind walls of smoke and flame. The Amtraks are loaded. The Higgins boats circle in choppy seas, forming assault waves. Tchaikovsky's platoon climbs down cargo nets strung along the sides of the transport. The nets sway with the swells. Men slip under the weight of weapons, ammunition, water rations, radios, and bazookas. Each Marine carries close to 100 extra pounds. They drop into Higgins boats that rise and fall sickeningly. Salt spray coats everything. Men are sick immediately. The boats form up and head for shore. At 8:44 in the morning, the ramp drops into chest-deep water. Tchaikovsky sees the beach through a curtain of spray and smoke and chaos. Machine gun fire kicks up geysers around the boat. Artillery shells detonate in the surf, throwing columns of water and shrapnel high into the air. In adjacent boats, men are hit before they even reach the water. On the sand, bodies already lie where they fell seconds ago. The northerly current has pushed the assault battalions of the 6th Marines approximately 400 yards too far north, widening the gap between the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions. That gap will matter later. Right now, all that matters is getting off the boat and across the killing ground. Tchaikovsky goes over the ramp first. He always goes first. His 40 thieves follow him into water red with the blood of Marines who landed moments before. They wade through the surf rifles above their heads while the world explodes around them. They reach the sand. Mortar rounds are landing among the assault waves. The seawall ahead is lined with the dead and the dying. But the 40 thieves do not stop at the seawall. They do not dig in. They do not wait for the line to consolidate. Their orders are different from every other unit on this beach. Keep moving. Find the Japanese. Radio their positions. Stay alive. By 9:30 in the morning, Tchaikovsky's platoon has pushed several hundred yards inland, farther than any other Marine unit on the beach. They are alone in enemy territory. The jungle closes around them like a fist. Somewhere ahead, 30,000 Japanese soldiers are waiting. Night will fall in 9 hours. And when darkness comes, the real mission of the 40 thieves will begin. The platoon moved through dense jungle growth in teams of 4 and 5, spaced 50 yards apart, maintaining visual contact through hand signals Tchaikovsky had developed during 6 months of training. Standard Marine tactics called for units to stay together, advance in formation, and maintain constant radio contact with regimental command. Tchaikovsky's orders were different. His platoon would operate independently. They would report enemy positions, but make their own tactical decisions in the field. No other Marine unit on Saipan had that authority. No other Marine unit on Saipan had earned it. The jungle was a living wall of green. Vines thick as a man's wrist hung from trees that blocked the sky. The air was heavy wet, and still the kind of tropical heat that soaked a uniform through in minutes and turned every step into labor. Insects swarmed in clouds. The ground was a tangle of roots and volcanic rock that twisted ankles and tore boot leather. Every shadow could hide a machine gun nest. Every thicket could conceal a sniper. The Marines moved with the slow deliberation of men who understood that speed kills, but carelessness kills faster. At approximately 10:15 in the morning, Corporal Ray Borowski, walking point on the left flank, raised his fist. The platoon froze. Through a gap in the vegetation, Borowski had spotted the first Japanese position. A concrete pillbox built into the side of a ridge, low and squat, its firing slit barely visible beneath a layer of cut branches and jungle debris. The camouflage was expert. From the beach, the position was completely invisible. From the valley below, where the 2nd Marine Division would advance later that afternoon, it was equally hidden. Only from the side at this precise angle, through this particular gap in the trees, could you see it at all. The pillbox housed a Type 92 heavy machine gun. Its interlocking field of fire covered the entire valley floor below. Tchaikovsky pulled out his map and traced the 3 possible routes the Marine advance would take that afternoon. The Japanese machine gun covered all 3. Every Marine who walked through that valley would step directly into a kill zone without knowing it existed until the first burst tore through them. Taking out the pillbox would save dozens of lives, possibly hundreds, but attacking it would reveal the 40 thieves' position and compromise their reconnaissance mission. They were supposed to be invisible. They were supposed to observe and report, not engage. Tchaikovsky made the decision in 30 seconds. He had carried bazookas for exactly this reason. Strombo positioned himself approximately 80 yards from the pillbox, while the rest of the platoon fanned out to provide security. 1 shooter, 1 loader, 1 shot. Strombo fired. The rocket crossed the distance in a heartbeat and entered the pillbox through its firing slit, the one opening in the concrete, a shot that required either extraordinary skill or extraordinary luck. The warhead detonated inside. The explosion killed the entire Japanese crew instantly. Before the smoke cleared, Tchaikovsky's platoon had already moved 300 yards deeper into the jungle. They left no trace of their presence except a destroyed pillbox and silence where a machine gun should have been. When units of the 2nd Marine Division advanced through that valley 4 hours later, they walked through uncontested. The men who lived never knew they were supposed to die. This was the mission of the 40 thieves. Find the enemy. Mark them for destruction. Disappear before the Japanese realized what was happening. Then do it again. By noon on June 15th, the platoon had identified and mapped 17 Japanese positions: machine gun nests, mortar pits, artillery observation posts, ammunition storage areas. Tchaikovsky radioed the encoded coordinates back to regimental headquarters. Within 20 minutes, naval gunfire from destroyers offshore began hitting the targets. The 40 thieves watched from concealed positions as 5-inch shells demolished Japanese fortifications they had marked half an hour earlier. Positions that would have cost dozens of Marine lives to take by frontal assault were reduced to rubble in minutes by accurate naval gunfire directed by 40 men the Japanese did not know existed. The platoon pushed approximately 2 miles inland by early afternoon, well ahead of any other American unit on Saipan. They moved through terrain the Marines would not reach for 3 more days. Every 100 yards revealed new Japanese positions. The island was more heavily fortified than anyone had predicted. Tucholsky counted over 200 enemy soldiers dug into one valley alone, in positions that would take days of bloody frontal assault to capture. But with accurate coordinates, naval gunfire could destroy those positions in minutes. The 40 thieves were not just gathering intelligence. They were changing how the Marine Corps fought. Then, at approximately 3:40 in the afternoon, the platoon discovered something that changed the entire battle. They smelled it before they saw it. Diesel exhaust. The heavy, unmistakable stench of military vehicles idling under camouflage. Tucholsky signaled the platoon to halt and moved forward with 2 men to investigate. In a grove of trees north of Charinkanoa, hidden beneath camouflage netting, sat a force of Japanese tanks from Colonel Hideki Goto's 9th Tank Regiment. Type 97 Chiha medium tanks and Type 95 Hago light tanks lined up in rows, their crews moving among them, loading ammunition, checking engines, preparing for something. Marine intelligence had estimated the Japanese possessed maybe a dozen tanks on the entire island. Tucholsky was looking at 3 times that number in a single location. The 9th Tank Regiment had 44 tanks committed to the defense of Saipan, and the bulk of them were right here staged and ready to move. The tanks represented the most serious threat to the American beachhead. Japanese doctrine called for massed armored attacks, preferably at night, when American naval gunfire and air support would be less effective. If these tanks hit the beach after dark, they could break through Marine lines, reach the vulnerable supply areas, destroy artillery positions and command posts, and potentially collapse the entire invasion before it gained a foothold. Tucholsky immediately radioed the coordinates to headquarters. The response came back within 8 minutes, and it was not what he wanted to hear. Naval gunfire was already fully engaged, supporting Marine units pinned down near the beach. Airstrikes were committed to other targets. Artillery was still being unloaded from the ships. No assets were available to hit the tank formation for at least 4 hours. By then, it would be dark and the tanks would have moved. If you are still watching, you already know these men matter. Hit that subscribe button. It helps this story find the people who need to hear it. Tucholsky looked at the tank formation and made a calculation that every officer dreads. His platoon carried bazookas and rockets, but the math was impossible. 40 men do not attack a tank regiment backed by infantry, not even 40 men recruited from the brig. The assault would accomplish nothing except getting his entire platoon killed in a grove that no one would find for days. But doing nothing was not an option either. Those tanks were going to attack the beachhead. The only question was whether the Marines would be ready. Tucholsky made the decision that defined his leadership on Saipan. The platoon would not attack. They would shadow the tank formation and report its every movement in real time. They would become the eyes of the regiment, tracking the most dangerous force on the island yard by yard, minute by minute, so that when the tanks finally struck, the Marines would know exactly where and when the blow was coming. He radioed headquarters with an update. Enemy tank force preparing for major assault. Will maintain observation and report movements. The response came back in 3 words. Maintain observation. Continue reporting. The Japanese tanks started their engines at 5:07 in the evening. 44 diesel engines roaring to life simultaneously made a sound that carried through the jungle like approaching thunder. Tank crews emerged from camouflage dugouts and climbed onto their vehicles. Officers shouted orders in Japanese. Infantry units of the 136th Infantry Regiment began forming up alongside the armor, approximately 1,000 soldiers on foot, preparing to follow the tanks into battle. This was not a probing attack. This was a full-scale armored assault aimed at the heart of the American beachhead. The 40 thieves followed the enemy formation at a distance of 200 yards, staying on the flank using jungle cover for concealment. Every 10 minutes, Tucholsky radioed updated coordinates showing the enemy's position, speed, and direction. At the beach, the entire 2nd Marine Division began preparing to receive a massed tank attack. Bazookas were distributed to frontline units. Sherman tanks from the 2nd Marine Tank Battalion moved into blocking positions. Artillery batteries adjusted their aim points. At 6:15 in the evening, approximately 1 mile from the beach, the Japanese formation halted. Through binoculars, Tucholsky watched officers gather for a conference. One pointed toward the coast, another gestured north, a third unrolled a map. They argued for 11 minutes. Then the officers returned to their units and the formation changed direction. Instead of continuing straight toward the main beachhead, the tanks turned north. Tucholsky understood almost immediately. The Japanese were not attacking the main beach. They were targeting the gap between the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, the same gap that had been widened when the northerly current pushed the 6th Marines too far north during the morning landing. A successful breakthrough there would split the American forces in half. The Japanese had found the weakest point in the entire American line. Tucholsky radioed the warning, but the Japanese had chosen their timing with precision. Dusk was falling. Radio communications became difficult as Marine units shifted frequencies for night operations. Artillery batteries were in the middle of ammunition resupply. Sherman tanks were refueling. The gap between divisions was defended by just 2 Marine companies, approximately 340 men against 44 tanks, and 1,000 Japanese infantry. At 7:23 in the evening, the attack began. The 40 thieves watched from elevated ground as enemy tanks rolled forward through the twilight. Marine defensive positions erupted with bazooka fire. The first Japanese tanks exploded in flames, orange fireballs that threw burning debris across the landscape and lit the advancing columns in flickering silhouette. But dozens more kept coming. Japanese infantry charged behind the armor, screaming, firing, dying, and being replaced by more men behind them. The sound was unlike anything the Marines had heard before. Dozens of tank engines roaring, machine guns hammering from every direction, the crack and blast of bazookas, the deeper boom of Sherman tank cannons. Explosions overlapping until the individual blasts blurred into a continuous roar, and underneath it all, the sound of men screaming in 2 languages. Marine positions buckled, then bent. The Japanese breakthrough was succeeding. Within 15 minutes, enemy tanks would reach the beach, and then Tucholsky saw it. One Japanese tank had separated from the main formation. It was moving fast through a ravine that led directly toward the 6th Marines Regimental Command Post. Colonel Risley was there, coordinating the entire divisional response to the attack. The tank commander had identified a weakness in Marine defenses, a 200-yard stretch of broken terrain where jungle and rock prevented easy positioning of anti-tank weapons. If that tank reached the command post, it would destroy the radio equipment, kill senior officers, and paralyze the American response at the worst possible moment. Risley was 400 yards away. He had no idea the tank was coming. In the chaos of a battle involving thousands of men and dozens of vehicles, a single tank grinding through a ravine was invisible. Tucholsky had maybe 3 minutes. He did not send a man. He did not radio for support. He grabbed his bazooka and he ran. Down the slope, through the darkness, toward the sound of the engine. He reached a position approximately 30 yards from the tank's projected path. The Type 97 emerged from the ravine, its turret rotating slowly, the cannon searching. The commander stood in the open hatch, scanning through binoculars, trying to confirm his position. The tank's frontal armor was 50 millimeters thick enough to deflect a bazooka round at the wrong angle. Tucholsky needed a side shot, below the turret ring, where the steel was thinnest. The tank moved forward, then it stopped. The engine idled. The commander checked his map by the glow of a hooded light inside the turret. Tucholsky fired. The rocket crossed 30 yards of darkness and hit the tank's left side just below the turret ring, exactly where the armor was weakest. The shaped charge penetrated the steel and detonated inside the crew compartment. 4 men died in less than a second. The stored ammunition cooked off moments later, and the entire vehicle erupted in a fireball that turned night into noon for 300 yards in every direction. Japanese infantry advancing nearby saw the massive explosion and made a critical assumption. They believed they had encountered a major Marine defensive position, a tank or an anti-tank gun emplacement with substantial forces behind it. They redirected their assault away from the command post and toward what they thought was a larger threat. In reality, there was one man standing alone in the dark. Tucholsky's single shot accomplished more than destroying one tank. It redirected an entire Japanese infantry force away from the most vulnerable point in American defenses. The command post remained secure. Colonel Risley continued coordinating the battle without interruption. The gap between divisions held. This was the story that Sergeant Al Yunker carried for decades. The story that William Parsons told in a church in Wisconsin. The moment that opened a footlocker and changed a son's understanding of his father forever. But the fireball that saved the command post also revealed Tucholsky's position to every Japanese soldier within 500 yards. Machine gun fire raked the area within seconds. Mortar rounds began falling, bracketing the platoon. The 40 thieves had to move immediately or die where they stood. The withdrawal through jungle darkness under fire tested everything these men had trained for. The platoon split into teams of 4 and 5, each group moving independently toward predetermined rally points. Japanese patrols were everywhere, searching for the Marines who had destroyed their tank. Flashlight beams cut through the undergrowth. Voices shouted commands in Japanese. Whistles blew. Strombo's team encountered a Japanese patrol at approximately 8:05 in the evening. 7 enemy soldiers moving through the jungle, sweeping the area with flashlights. Strombo and 3 Marines lay flat in the undergrowth as the patrol passed within 10 feet. One Japanese soldier stopped. He turned his flashlight toward the spot where Strombo was hiding. He stared into the darkness. Strombo did not breathe. He did not blink. He lay with his face pressed into rotting leaves and his finger on the trigger of his Springfield, and he waited. The Japanese soldier stood there for 43 seconds. Then he moved on. The patrol continued past without detecting the Americans. By 9 o'clock, approximately half the platoon had reached the primary rally point, a small clearing 600 yards behind Marine lines. Tchaikovsky counted 23 men. More than a dozen were still out there in the dark, dead, captured, or lost. He moved the assembled group back to friendly lines using the recognition signal he had established during training. 3 short whistles followed by 2 long ones. Marine sentries challenged them. Tchaikovsky gave the correct password. The 40 thieves crossed into American-held territory at 9:41 in the evening. 23 men had made it back. The rest were somewhere in the darkness between the lines. The Japanese tank attack continued through the night. Marine bazookas destroyed 11 tanks. Sherman tanks knocked out 9 more. Artillery disabled 7. When dawn broke on June 16th, the Japanese had lost the majority of their 44 tanks. The largest armored assault in Pacific War history had failed, but it had cost the Marines dearly. Hundreds of casualties along the line. The gap between divisions had held but barely. At first light, Tchaikovsky sent search teams back into the jungle. 4 men per team. Find the missing Marines. Return by noon. They found the first body at 7:05 in the morning. Daniel Kenny had been shot twice in the chest during the night withdrawal. He died instantly. His dog tags were missing. The Japanese collected American identification as trophies. The search teams found more bodies. Some Marines had been captured alive and executed. Their hands were tied behind their backs. They had been bayoneted. Japanese forces on Saipan rarely took prisoners. The Imperial Army considered surrender a disgrace and extended that contempt to enemy soldiers who fell into their hands. 6 missing Marines were found alive, having evaded capture through the night and reached Marine lines at different locations. 5 more were discovered hiding in a cave system approximately 1 mile behind Japanese lines. They were alive but pinned down by enemy patrols and could not move without being detected. Tchaikovsky assembled a 6-man rescue team and moved out at 11:47 in the morning. They reached the cave system in under an hour. The 5 trapped Marines were exhausted and dehydrated, but uninjured. One had malaria with a fever of 103. Another had dysentery so severe he could barely stand. They had spent the night listening to Japanese patrols pass within yards of their position. The extraction required covering 1 mile through Japanese territory in broad daylight with 2 men who could barely walk. Tchaikovsky chose speed over concealment. They started moving immediately. They made it 400 yards before encountering a Japanese patrol. 20 enemy soldiers in a search formation. Tchaikovsky chose ambush. The Marines set an L-shaped formation and waited. When the Japanese walked into the kill zone, 11 Marines opened fire simultaneously. The patrol was destroyed in 7 seconds. 20 enemy dead. No survivors. No radio transmissions sent. But the gunfire carried for half a mile. Japanese units began converging. The Marines ran. They reached a steep ravine and had no choice but to descend, half sliding and half climbing, supporting the 2 sick men between them. Japanese soldiers appeared on the ridge above within a minute. They opened fire downward into the ravine. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks. 1 Marine was hit in the leg. Another took shrapnel from a grenade. The ravine channeled them in one direction. They could only move forward, and then the ravine ended. A box canyon, sheer rock walls on 3 sides. No exit. Japanese soldiers began descending from multiple points above. Tchaikovsky counted at least 40 visible, with more arriving every minute. His 11 Marines had perhaps 200 rounds of ammunition between them. 2 men could not fight effectively. Artillery support was impossible at this range. Airstrikes would hit friendly forces. They were trapped. Then Tchaikovsky noticed something the Japanese had not. The rear wall of the canyon was not solid. Vegetation growing at the base suggested water seepage. Water seepage meant a crack in the stone. He sent 2 men to investigate. They reported back in under 2 minutes. Behind the vegetation was a narrow opening barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Beyond it, the fissure widened into a passage that climbed upward through the rock. The Marines pushed the 2 sick men through first. Then one by one the rest followed. They removed their packs and dragged them behind. The passage was pitch black. They moved by touch, following the man ahead climbing steeply through solid rock, while behind them, Japanese soldiers entered the box canyon and called to each other in confusion, searching for Americans who had vanished into stone. The passage emerged on the opposite side of the ridge, 400 yards from where they had entered. The Marines found themselves behind the Japanese search party, with the enemy focused on the empty canyon below. They moved fast toward friendly lines, covering the final distance in 8 minutes. They used recognition signals. They crossed into American territory at 2:23 in the afternoon. All 11 Marines reached safety. The 2 sick men were evacuated to medical stations immediately. By nightfall on June 16th, the 40 thieves had accounted for nearly all their men. Several were confirmed dead. A few remained missing and would be listed as missing in action. The platoon had suffered significant losses in its first 48 hours on Saipan, but they had accomplished something no other unit on the island could claim. They had identified over 200 Japanese positions. They had called in coordinates that destroyed dozens of enemy fortifications before Marine infantry had to assault them. They had tracked the largest Japanese tank attack in Pacific history and provided the intelligence that allowed the 2nd Marine Division to prepare its defense. And their commander had personally destroyed a tank that was minutes from reaching the regimental command post and potentially collapsing the entire American position. Colonel Risley sent a message to Tukovsky at 1800 hours. The 40 thieves would have 1 night to rest, resupply, and absorb replacements for the men they had lost. At dawn on June 17th, they would go back into the jungle, deeper this time, into the caves where the Japanese had hidden their artillery, and eventually into the streets of the enemy capital itself. At 05:30 hours on June 17, 1944, the 40 thieves moved out from Marine lines in complete darkness. Their objective was a ridge system 3 miles inland that Marine intelligence believed contained the Japanese artillery positions that had been shelling American forces continuously for 2 days. Those guns had killed dozens of Marines and disrupted supply operations on the beaches. Aerial reconnaissance could not locate them because the Japanese had hidden them inside caves carved into the volcanic rock. Bombs fell on empty ridgelines. The guns kept firing. Only men on the ground could find them. The platoon moved in complete silence. No voices, no radio transmissions. Communication by hand, signals only. They covered the first mile in 47 minutes without encountering Japanese patrols. The second mile took longer. The terrain climbed steeply into the foothills of Mount Tapachau. Dense vegetation grabbed at their legs and arms. Volcanic rock crumbled underfoot, threatening to send loose stones clattering downhill and betray their presence. They reached the target ridge system at approximately 08:15 hours and began systematic reconnaissance. The ridge stretched for roughly 2 miles, rising 600 feet above the surrounding jungle. Japanese positions were everywhere. Tukovsky counted 8 cave entrances large enough to conceal artillery pieces. Trails connected the caves along the ridgeline, worn smooth by the boots of gun crews, who moved their weapons from one position to another, fired several rounds, and relocated before American counter-battery fire could respond. This was why Marine artillery had failed to silence the enemy guns. They were shooting at positions the Japanese had already abandoned. Finding the guns was only part of the mission. Tuchovsky also needed to map the tunnel system so that when Marine assault units eventually reached this area, they would know what they were walking into. Mapping the tunnels meant entering them. Mullins and Strombo volunteered. The 2 Marines from Dixon, Montana and Kayford Mountain, West Virginia, the hunter and the coal miner's son, stepped forward without hesitation. Mullins had grown up underground. The darkness of a Japanese cave held no mystery for a man who had spent his childhood watching his father disappear into the mines before dawn. Strombo had the patience and the steadiness, the ability to be still when every nerve in his body screamed at him to run. They entered the largest cave opening at approximately 09:40 hours. The rest of the platoon took up concealed positions outside, rifles ready, having committed to wait however long it took. The cave swallowed them. Inside, the darkness was total. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off where the eyes eventually adjust and shapes emerge. This was the darkness of the earth itself, heavy and absolute. They used small flashlights shielded with cupped hands, the beams reduced to dim circles on the rock floor directly ahead of their boots. One wrong angle, and the light would travel down the tunnel like a signal flare. The cave extended 200 feet into the ridge before branching into multiple passages. The walls were rough volcanic rock damp with condensation. Water dripped from the ceiling in a rhythm that echoed through the tunnels and masked smaller sounds, which was both a blessing and a danger. It masked their footsteps. It also masked anyone approaching. The air grew thicker the deeper they went. Gunpowder residue, human waste, the sour tang of men living underground for weeks, and underneath it all, an earthy mineral coldness that reminded Mullins of every mine shaft he had ever descended as a boy in West Virginia. Different continent, different war, same darkness. They found the first artillery piece at approximately 10-12 hours. A Type 91 105mm howitzer positioned 30 feet inside a side passage, its barrel aimed toward a carefully concealed opening in the rock face. Ammunition was stored in recesses carved into the walls, row after row of shells stacked with care. The gun crew was absent rotating shifts somewhere deeper in the system. Mullins and Strombo marked the location and continued deeper. Over the next 40 minutes, they discovered 2 more artillery pieces, a command post with field telephones and maps tacked to the rock walls, an ammunition magazine containing approximately 2,000 rounds and sleeping quarters, with straw mats and personal belongings scattered across the stone floor. At least 60 soldiers lived inside this mountain. At 11:03 hours, the sound of the dripping water changed. Another sound threaded through it. Footsteps, voices, growing louder, coming from a passage that intersected theirs approximately 20 feet ahead. They killed their flashlights. Total darkness. Mullins pressed his back against the rock wall and reached out until his fingers found Strombo's shoulder. Neither man moved. Neither man breathed. They stood in blackness so complete that there was no difference between eyes open and eyes closed, and they listened. The footsteps grew louder. A glow appeared around the curve of the intersecting passage, warm flickering the light of a lantern carried by someone walking at the front of a column. Then voices close enough now to make out individual tones, though not words. A dozen men at least talking the way soldiers talk when they feel safe in their own territory. The glow brightened. Shadows swung across the ceiling of the intersection ahead. Mullins could feel the vibration of boots through the rock floor. The column entered the intersection and turned down the main passage, moving perpendicular to where the 2 Americans stood, pressed flat against the wall in a darkness they prayed was deep enough. The lantern light washed down the tunnel. For one moment, it reached the wall where Mullins and Strombo stood, painting it in dim orange. But the light source was moving the shadows, shifting with every step, and a man carrying a lantern in a dark tunnel sees only what the lantern illuminates directly ahead of him. He does not study the walls. He does not scan for threats in a place he considers safe. He walks, and the circle of light walks with him, and everything outside that circle does not exist. The column passed. 12 men. The last footstep faded. The glow receded around a far curve, and the darkness returned total and suffocating. Mullins and Strombo waited 60 seconds. Then they moved toward the exit. They had gathered enough. The tunnel map was detailed enough for Marine planners to design an assault. Staying longer meant gambling that the next group through that intersection would also fail to look sideways. They emerged into daylight at 11:27 hours. The jungle outside seemed impossibly bright. The rest of the platoon materialized from concealment rifles ready, having spent nearly 2 hours listening for gunfire that would have meant their friends were dead. Tchaikovsky examined the map. The intelligence was invaluable. Standard frontal assault would be catastrophic. The only viable approach was to seal the cave entrances with demolitions and systematically destroy each position. But Marine engineers with the necessary explosives were still days away. The information would wait. The caves would not move. 9 days passed. 9 days of continuous reconnaissance missions behind Japanese lines of mapping positions of calling. In naval gunfire coordinates of silent movement through hostile jungle of not enough food and not enough water and not enough sleep. The 40 thieves operated like ghosts, appearing and disappearing along the American front, bringing back intelligence that no other unit could provide. On June 26, 1944, Tchaikovsky received orders to reconnoiter Garapan, the administrative capital of Japanese-held Saipan. Marine commanders needed to know if the enemy was defending the town in force or had pulled back. The assault on Garapan was coming. The Marines needed to know what they would be walking into. Tchaikovsky selected 4 men: Strombo, Mullins, Corporal Don Evans, Private Eddie Dulcich, 5 men total including himself. They stripped down to essentials: rifles, knives, sidearms, canteens. Everything that might rattle or clink was removed or taped silent. They approached Garapan from the east at approximately 1540 hours. The town had been devastated by bombing and naval gunfire. Buildings stood in jagged ruins. Smoke rose from fires that had been burning for days. But through the destruction, Japanese soldiers moved with purpose. They were not retreating, they were reorganizing. Garapan was being used as a staging area for counterattacks, a hub where units gathered, resupplied, and moved toward American lines. Tucholsky needed to move through the town. 5 men on foot creeping through rubble, while hundreds of Japanese soldiers occupied every block, was a slow way to die. Then Don Evans saw the bicycles. 5 of them leaning against the wall of a partially destroyed building next to what had been a Japanese military police station. Standard Japanese military bicycles, the lightweight folding type that officers and dispatch riders used to move between positions. 5 bicycles. 5 Marines. The idea arrived in every man's head at the same moment. In the chaos of a bombed-out city where Japanese soldiers moved in every direction, where confusion was the baseline condition of existence, 5 men on bicycles would look exactly like 5 Japanese soldiers riding between positions. Officers on bicycles were common. No one questioned men who looked like they belonged. The disguise was not physical. It was behavioral. 5 men riding purposefully through a town, project authority, and belonging. People do not stop men who look like they know where they are going. The plan violated every principle of reconnaissance ever written. You do not ride bicycles through the middle of an enemy strongpoint in broad daylight. Tucholsky approved it instantly. This was why he recruited from the brig. They took the bicycles. At approximately 17:15 hours on June 26, 1944, 5 United States Marines began riding through the capital city of Japanese-held Saipan. They rode casually, not fast, not slow. Springfield rifles slung over their backs, hands on handlebars, eyes everywhere. They did not hide. They did not skulk. They rode like men who had somewhere to be, and no particular reason to hurry. Japanese soldiers ignored them. Some waved. Others shouted greetings in Japanese that the Marines did not understand, but acknowledged with a raised palm, a nod, the universal gesture of soldiers too busy to stop and talk. The Marines passed within yards of an officer studying a map spread across a field table. They rode past a motor pool where trucks were being loaded with ammunition. They circled a plaza where a company of infantry was forming up for an evening patrol. They passed a building where a Japanese flag hung from a second-story window, and a voice inside was speaking urgently into a field telephone. No one stopped them. No one questioned them. No one gave them a second look. For 43 minutes, 5 American Marines rode stolen bicycles through the beating heart of the enemy's command structure, memorizing positions, counting troops, identifying supply dumps and ammunition caches and command posts. They collected more intelligence in 43 minutes on bicycles than a week of aerial reconnaissance had produced. At approximately 17:58 hours, they completed their circuit and exited the town heading north. They continued riding for another mile before abandoning the bicycles in the undergrowth and disappearing into the jungle. On the road to Garapan, before entering the town, Strombo had come across the body of a Japanese captain named Sadao Yasue, killed days earlier by American mortar fire. On Yasue's body was a Yosagaki Hinomaru, a good luck flag, a piece of white silk covered with calligraphy, the signatures and prayers of his family and friends back in Japan. Every Japanese soldier carried one. Each flag was a piece of home pressed against the heart, a talisman meant to bring him safely back to the people who loved him. Captain Yasue was not coming back. Strombo folded the silk flag and put it in his pack. It weighed almost nothing. He would carry the weight of it for 73 years. The battle for Saipan ground on for 13 more days. 13 days of jungle fighting that reduced strong men to skeletal shadows of themselves. Malaria struck with fevers that cracked fillings and left men shaking so violently they could not hold a rifle. Dysentery hollowed them out from the inside. Tropical ulcers opened on their legs and refused to heal. They lost 5 to 7 pounds a week. Their uniforms hung on them like clothes borrowed from larger men. They ran out of food and stole from Japanese supply dumps, eating rice and canned fish meant for the enemy. They ran out of water and drank from streams they knew were contaminated, trading future sickness for present survival. They ran out of ammunition and picked up Japanese weapons from the dead. On June 30th, Russell Dyer was killed. A 6-man patrol from the 40 Thieves walked into a Japanese ambush. The enemy had laid wounded Marines on a trail as bait, knowing that Americans would stop to help their own. When the patrol moved toward the wounded, machine guns opened fire from 3 sides. After 2 failed attempts by the squad to knock out the position, Dyer told his squadmates to keep their eyes on the tree line. Then he stood up. He walked into the open. He made himself the target. Every Japanese gunner shifted fire toward the one man standing exposed, and in doing so, revealed their exact positions to the Marines behind cover. It worked. The machine gun nest was destroyed. But Dyer was hit multiple times. Wounded badly, he continued forward, leading a 3rd assault on the position before his body gave out. He was 21 years old. He received the Navy Cross posthumously. Roscoe Mullins could never speak of Dyer's death without weeping. He did not cry about Daniel Kenny. He did not cry about the others. But something about watching a friend deliberately sacrifice himself with calm, calculated selflessness broke something inside Mullins that 7 decades could not repair. Roscoe would break into tears every time he tried to talk about it, Joseph Tarkovsky wrote. Every time. In the final days, the 40 Thieves witnessed scenes that no training or toughness could prepare them for. As the Marines pushed north, Japanese soldiers and civilians retreated to the cliffs at the tip of the island. Rather than surrender, entire families jumped. Mothers threw their children first, then leaped after them. Old men walked to the edge and stepped off without a word. Japanese soldiers shot civilians who hesitated, then followed them into the air. The Marines watched from below. They shouted through loudspeakers in Japanese, begging the people to surrender, promising food and safety. Some listened. Most did not. On July 7th, Lieutenant General Saito, knowing the battle was lost, composed a farewell message and committed ritual suicide. Admiral Nagumo, the man who had commanded the attack on Pearl Harbor, shot himself. Before dying, Saito ordered a final assault. Approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and armed civilians, many carrying nothing more than sharpened bamboo poles, charged south in the largest banzai attack of the Pacific War. They overwhelmed 2 battalions of the Army's 105th Infantry Regiment before being stopped by massed artillery and desperate last-stand defenses. On July 9, 1944, Saipan was declared secure. The 40 Thieves had lost 5 men confirmed killed in action. Others were wounded. Every survivor was physically devastated. Most had lost 30 to 40 pounds. Several had active malaria. All of them had seen things that would follow them into every room they entered for the rest of their lives. But the platoon that was expected to suffer 73% casualties had survived at a rate far above prediction. And the reason was exactly what Risley and Tarkovsky had theorized: men who could think independently, who could improvise, who knew when to fight and when to vanish, survived. Where men trained only to follow orders did not. Marine commanders estimated the intelligence provided by the 40 Thieves reduced overall casualties by a significant margin, potentially saving thousands of lives. Everything that came after Saipan, every Navy SEAL team that operates behind enemy lines, every Marine Force reconnaissance unit that penetrates enemy territory alone, every Special Forces detachment that relies on small unit independence, traces a direct line back to what these men proved on this island. A handful of highly trained men operating independently behind enemy lines, making their own decisions, can accomplish what entire battalions cannot. Before Saipan, this was theory. After Saipan, it was written into the operational manuals of every elite unit in the American military. The 40 Thieves did not just survive the battle, they changed how America fights wars. Tarkovsky never knew this. He went home and became a mayor and never mentioned Saipan again. The homecoming destroyed men that combat had not. Most members of the 40 Thieves suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1945, no one had a name for it. They had nightmares. They drank. They could not hold jobs. They could not explain to their wives or their children why they woke up screaming, or why a car backfiring sent them diving behind furniture, or why they sometimes sat in dark rooms and stared at nothing for hours. The skills that kept a thief alive in the war did not translate into peacetime. Knowing how to kill silently was not a marketable skill in post-war America. Knowing how to steal a Jeep was not something you put on a job application. Bob Smots went home to Georgia and carried a weight he could not set down. The reason I had trouble talking about what happened, he told Joseph decades later, was that I feared I was beyond forgiveness for the things I had done. Roscoe Mullins went back to Caford Mountain and prayed. Every day, for the people he had killed, every single day for the rest of his life. Marvin Strombo returned to Montana. He married. He had 4 children. When his wife left him shortly after the birth of their fourth child, he raised them alone. He just put all of his focus on raising us, his daughter Sandra said, and making sure that we felt loved and safe and had a roof over our heads. And Frank Tarkovsky, he went to the University of Wisconsin on the GI Bill. He moved to Sturgeon Bay. He married Roxy. He raised Joseph. He became a city councilman, then a mayor. He changed the channel when war programs came on television. He kept the Foot Locker closed. For every Mother Teresa Frank said once in the only glimpse he ever offered, there are many more Stalins and Hitlers. We are an odd species in that we can create Sistine chapels and centers of great learning, yet consistently find ways for extreme cruelty to one another. That was all he ever said. Bill Nupple, the old platoon sergeant from Minnesota, said it most simply about the boys who died on Saipan. They never had a chance at life. And so many Japanese boys were just like us. Frank Tarkovsky died on September 10, 2011, at the age of 96. His son opened a Foot Locker and found a war. For 73 years, Marvin Strombo kept the silk flag he had taken from the body of Captain Sadao Yasue. It sat in a drawer in his log home in Missoula, folded and quiet. He had written a note and tucked it inside. I have always believed that it did not belong to me. It belonged to you. I pray this flag finds its way home, and if you are reading this, it has. In 2017, through a series of newspaper articles and with the help of the Obon Society, the descendants of Captain Yasue were located in Japan. His younger brother Tatsuya was still alive. In August 2017, Marvin Strombo, 93 years old, flew across the Pacific Ocean. He had crossed that same ocean 73 years earlier in a troop transport, a 19-year-old boy heading toward a war that would mark every remaining day of his life. Now he crossed it as a pilgrim. He met Tatsuya Yasue and a grandnephew named Naoki. He placed the flag in the old man's hands. A 93-year-old American Marine who had killed Japanese soldiers on Saipan traveled across the world to return a piece of a fallen enemy officer's soul to his family. An act of war ended with an act of grace. Strombo and the Yasue family became friends. Naoki visited Montana the following year. They sat together and looked through picture books, an American veteran and the grandnephew of the man whose flag he had carried for 7 decades. Different countries, different languages, different sides of the same war, same humanity. Marvin Strombo died on June 22, 2020, at the age of 96 in the log home in Missoula, where he had lived for 6 decades. 3 weeks earlier, the book 40 Thieves on Saipan had been published. His daughter Sandra said he thought it was wonderful that the stories of all those men were finally going to be told. Roscoe Mullins from Kayford Mountain, West Virginia. The coal miner's son who crawled through Japanese tunnels and wept for Russell Dyer and prayed every day for the men he killed became the last surviving member of the 40 Thieves. Joseph Tarkovsky closed the Foot Locker. He understood now. His father did not stay silent out of shame or indifference. Frank Tarkovsky sealed the war inside himself because the weight of it was too heavy to share with the people he loved. He protected his family from the war by carrying it alone the way he had carried that bazooka through the darkness toward a Japanese tank, the way he had carried the responsibility of 40 lives through every mission on Saipan. The man who wins the fight goes to the brig. The man who loses goes to the infirmary. Frank Tarkovsky wanted the man in the brig because he understood something the Marine Corps did not. The men who break the rules are the men who survive. The men who think for themselves are the men who save the men beside them. The Marines who called them criminals were wrong. They were warriors. They were the men nobody wanted who became the men everybody needed. If Lieutenant Tarkovsky's story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We tell these stories because the men who lived them deserve to be remembered. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Pacific. Tell us if you knew a man like Frank Tarkovsky, a quiet man who kept a Foot Locker closed for decades and carried the weight so his family would not have to. Frank Tarkovsky and his 40 Thieves deserve to be remembered. And now, because a son opened a Foot Locker, they will be.